I've recently been slowly reading my way back towards the end of the Legends timeline, and as I approach the end, there's something coming to mind a lot that I've been wanting to talk about, which is a mistake that I think Star Wars regularly has made throughout its history, namely how time gaps get introduced and then handled. Now, before we get too into this, it's not something that I think is universally wrong or universally handled poorly, and sometimes it's even necessary, especially for certain mediums like movies. But it is something that creates some of what I consider to be the biggest issues in how certain stories get handled. It'd probably be more fair to call it the thing Star Wars does a lot, which I don't like except for how sometimes it's necessary and gets handled better than others, but I only have so many characters for the title. Basically, the problem is this. There are a lot of points where new pieces of Star Wars media will jump forward or backward in time, or even just start a story closer to its end, which then limits what can be told in the interim or ties the hands of future stories. Sometimes this comes through with the galaxy as a whole, or sometimes it's just related to the story of an individual character. And this is something which has happened throughout both new canon and Legends to varying degrees. It's not something where I'm trying to single out either continuity. It often happens for different reasons, sometimes even quite good ones, but the effects it can still have can make certain areas and eras less interesting for me when it comes to other individual stories. For larger picture stuff like source books, it's never really been something that's bothered me as much. And before we get too into this, I do want to emphasize that it's not about the quality of the stories that create these time gaps, it's just the fact that these time gaps then exist and the impact it has on surrounding media. Sometimes this does happen for some pretty obvious and inescapable real-world reasons. Star Wars was, of course, introduced to us with the original trilogy being the final years of an empire that had been around for decades, with the obvious world building that came with the mentions of the Clone Wars in the past, and we were kind of seeing the end of the rebellion. You obviously have to start somewhere, and no matter what your story is, you're probably going to generate some interest in what happened not just immediately after, but also long before, unless your world building is just really boring, and that wasn't the case with what we got in the original trilogy. So it's not that I have any qualms with the fact that the prequels came the way they did, set 20 to 30 years earlier, telling the story of how Darth Vader came to be. But unfortunately, this has often meant that some of the stories that take place in the Clone Wars or Galactic Civil War between episodes 3 and 4, or even 4 and 6, have held less interest for me personally when they deal with things on a broader scale compared to what happened after Endor, just because we knew where a lot of the stories were going, and the hands of the authors ended up being somewhat more tied with some of those characters. An example of something that suffers from what I'm talking about comes from one of my favorite authors, Timothy Zahn, with the first Thrawn trilogy he wrote within the Disney canon, specifically Alliances and Treason in particular. I really enjoyed the first book of the trilogy, and there was plenty of room to tell good stories with Thrawn in the Imperial era without kind of falling prey to what I was talking about. But at this point, Thrawn had already had his fate set up within Rebels. Even though he does seem to be coming back, we still had a clear endpoint for where Thrawn was going within that era. There was a limit on how high scale the Grist threat seems to have been able to be, and how free Timothy Zahn could be with his character. We're even getting some of that with the Ascendancy trilogy that's coming out right now, and that does create one of my least favorite parts of that trilogy, even though I'm still really enjoying the trilogy overall. I don't want to spoil too much about the books, because I know a lot of people haven't had a chance to read them yet who may still be intending to, but it once again involves the Grist, and it's something that is set like 20 years before what we get later on with the second Thrawn trilogy, which continues that conflict, so we kind of know where we're going to end up with that. It's not necessarily that the individual stories end up being bad, it's just that it can sometimes let the air to the tires with the story as it's being told. So again, the problem that I'm talking about rarely has to do with the specifics of the content that creates the gap. It's more about how it sets up the expectations and possibilities around it. There are several things that I have talked about or that I'm going to talk about in today's video where I do like the particular media that creates the gap, and even understand why it does it, but where I still think it kind of has the same effect. Sometimes I can even totally understand why a gap needed to be created, even if I don't love the set of stories that created it. On the Legends side, one of the biggest gaps that always stuck out to me as kind of a limiting factor, and which made me kind of skeptical of what we'd be getting going forward, was the jump between the Legacy of the Force books and the Legacy comics. By the end, of course, Fate of the Jedi had come out, as well as a few standalone novels or shorter stories, but the gap was created between the two with the Legacy titles introducing the Legacy era, so they're the kind of more relevant ones here. In Legacy of the Force, we'd made it to about 40 years after Yavin, but we were simultaneously getting Dark Horse's comics set almost 100 years after that. If there'd been a few hundred years more of a gap, and we'd been able to just say at some point there'd be a couple hundred years apiece or something, or where there's maybe a couple events worth covering, but not really enough to shake up the story, kind of like what you got between, for example, the Darth Bane books and the prequel trilogy, that probably wouldn't have had the same effect where I see the gap quite as negatively as I do this one that we ended up getting. Instead, between Legacy itself and some of the flashbacks that get set up within the comics, we have a pretty clear timeline of events that pretty much need to happen, and which severely limit what can happen with certain other storylines. Because of some of those flashbacks and how things get presented with the lives of Cole and Nat Rock Skywalker in particular, we know that by about 50 years after Legacy of the Force, almost every character of the New Jedi Order, including some that are rather young, have to be dead or on their way out, and they're definitely gone by about 40 years after that, by the time the comics are actually taking place, even though there's some reappearances by some of the prequel Jedi who hadn't been accounted for in Order 66, like Kakruk and Darth Krayt being holdover as well. Those particular connections are probably why they wanted it set when it was, because it could still be feasible that some of those characters would be alive, but it has some pretty big impacts on the other characters that were more important in the prior series. This does mean that not only do we have confirmation that Luke and Leia wouldn't be around, which is totally understandable given how old they'd be, we had pretty low ceilings for the presence and impact of some of the younger generation, who would have been around still in some of those instances, and really aren't that old, like Ben Skywalker, Jaina Solo, Lobaka, and particularly Alana. Even without any kind of flashbacks, Alana, who was the daughter of Tenel Ka and Jacen Solo, and the granddaughter of Han and Leia, could easily have still been alive herself in the actual Legacy period without any of the flashbacks. Maybe she was in the background, but it was kind of weird having everything set up with her in Legacy of the Force, and then we were simultaneously getting comics that severely limited the impact of what we were seeing unfold in the Legacy of the Force books as they were coming out. It honestly seemed like almost everything from Dark Nest on really wasn't taken into account too much with the Legacy comics. Even the state of the galaxy was in a kind of interesting position after Legacy of the Force. We were starting to get the Empire re-emerging in some ways, and more interestingly to me, the Second Galactic Civil War between the Galactic Alliance and Corellia actually ended with the Corellian Federation still as an independent power. For pretty much the first time ever, we had a situation where we were going to see two major powers trying to coexist without the default being war. Legacy, though, made it clear that the state wouldn't last that long, and the only real progression we got outside of that, or any reference to any other factional developments for the next 100 years, would mean we just get to see kind of the development of the Fel Empire. There likely still would have been some story based around reconciling with Corellia, but it was kind of a foregone conclusion by that point, even at the time that the story was still being told, the initial Legacy of the Force story. Now again, I don't want this to be a video about going over the specific quality of any of these specific stories that introduce the time jumps. There are plenty of people who will love or hate them for various reasons. I'm just trying to focus on the impact that happens on the surrounding stories. You could theoretically have a different publishing order that just keeps going forwards through time from Legacy of the Force, and end up with a story that ends up just being exactly Legacy, the same way it happened. But the point I'm trying to get at is the kind of limiting factor that it puts on the stuff that's going to be coming out between them. I'm sure it would have been perfectly possible to tell individual good stories within those periods, and with some of the characters I mentioned as being shortchanged a bit, but it wouldn't have quite the same impact, and knowing the endpoint does add a little bit of disappointment, or even at least lessening some of the anticipation for it. This is similarly an issue that exists within the sequel trilogy. Like the prequels, this is one where it's easy to see why a time jump happens when establishing the new canon. You obviously have to tailor the time period to the age of Harrison Ford, Carrie Fisher, and Mark Hamill. It doesn't make sense to try to publish 30 years of material before making those movies again either, so that people can rush through them before getting to the movies. The result is that a lot of stories focusing on the main progression of the galaxy, or the characters of Luke, Han, and Leia in the interim, are just going to be less interesting for a lot of people. There's still some elements I find interesting about Luke's attempt to restart the Jedi Academy going wrong, but knowing the endpoint going in does take something away from it, and I imagine it also makes it a bit harder for the authors to work with as well. As I mentioned earlier, I don't think this is necessarily a universal effect. I've enjoyed a lot of the smaller scale stuff, or stuff with new characters, but some of the big picture stuff has held a bit less interest for me. For example, I've loved Alphabet Squadron and The Mandalorian, because while there are galactic implications to what they're doing in those books and in the shows, the primary characters are people whose stories remain kind of open-ended and where we don't know where they're going to end up. I did basically a whole standalone video on some of these things that I did enjoy despite kind of fitting into those time gaps, so I won't get into too much of that here. Now, some people would probably point to the possibility of creating a new trilogy in the Legends continuity instead to solve this issue, and take a drink for each comment made about this before getting to this section of the video, but that's a whole other discussion. Suffice to say that I don't think the Dark Nest Crisis really sticks out as a great candidate for a movie trilogy, and if you do try to slot something into the 5-year dead zone between New Jedi Order and Dark Nest, or Dark Nest and Legacy of the Force, you introduce a lot of the same issues that I'm talking about now, where we already know what the outcome would look like. It doesn't solve the problem, it just flips what's responsible. You would get the exact same problem except in reverse. So whatever your thoughts on the reboot or the sequels, I don't think that's as relevant as a point in this particular discussion. Now, these issues do tend to relax a bit for me when going the opposite direction in the time period, partially because we had pretty blank slates for some of the earlier characters, and because a lot of the time jumps to earlier periods are much longer, which is something that I did bring up earlier as a potential way to mitigate what the effect is from the legacy jump, and it's something that Eckhart's Ladder has brought up a lot as well when we talk about that issue. The jump back to Darth Bane's trilogy, for example, left everything pretty much open except for some very broad points, where characters had a lot of freedom to be explored, even if some of the lines of the original trilogy and prequel trilogy set up what was going on a little bit. Jumping back even further to Knights of the Old Republic, and you have the same situation, where we had maybe some rough ideas of what happened, but still a lot of free and open spaces. You do get into a bit of a problem when talking about the stuff that would take place between Knights of the Old Republic and the Old Republic MMO, where it's only a couple hundred years and there's some clear through lines with some characters, much like the Fate of the Jedi to Legacy problem we covered already, and it does get compounded a little bit by the fact that there does seem to be some pretty major or important events that happen between them, so they probably would have been covered eventually. The High Republic in New Canon is another thing that I think jumps back just far enough, though it plays a bit more dangerously with the timeline, since it does include characters like Yoda. That and the fact that we know that there's not a huge amount of direct conflict pre-Clone Wars does kind of limit what can happen between the High Republic series and the prequels, though there's a lot of behind-the-scenes stuff in the prequel trilogy that does get hinted at, which could make some good ground for stories to go on, especially if there are more background stories. Something in the style of Darth Plagueis, for example, which ended up being one of the best novels in Legends. It tied a bunch of stuff together and was really interesting while still being in one of those gap periods, and it did it really well. Either way, that's going to do it for today's video. Do you agree or disagree that these time jumps, like with the Legacy era, their sequels, or even smaller scale stuff like Thrawn's story, end up being a problem for expanding storylines? Let me know in the comments. If you've enjoyed the video, please leave a like and subscribe for more, or consider supporting the channel on Patreon, which is linked in the description. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next time.